You made it to the Go Commando Show with Fred Galvin. On our new mission, we contend with the naked truths of health, leadership, and overcoming adversity. Now it's time to go commando.
Hello, Commandos. Welcome to the Go Commando Show, and we have an excellent show for you today with the Battle of Antietam. And we're going to explain a little bit about the Battle of Antietam, and then we're going to go out to the battlefield and show you exactly what happened on different portions of the train from the beginning of that battle. It was primarily a one-day battle, all the way to the end of the battle. So with me is another retired Marine Corps officer. He was my first commanding officer. He's Colonel Kelly Alexander. We will talk a little bit about his career in a separate segment, so stay tuned. But we wanted to talk about the time frame leading up to this is the year of 1862. America is having a civil war, and President Lincoln and President Jackson are diametrically opposed. They want to end this war fast. President Lincoln decides to have what they call a peninsular campaign and doing an amphibious operation, push a force down to the Chesapeake Bay and launch from the sea across the land and then siege the Confederates' headquarters in Richmond, Virginia. That is what leads up to this battle that we're going to talk about today and that we're going to go on the battlefield study and describe to you is the one day's bloodiest battle in American history. So when we're talking about in a 24-hour period, why we were here, and we're going to quantify the numbers of casualties, both death and wounded from both sides that occurred, and what makes the Battle of Sharpsburg, or later termed the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. So, again, the Peninsular Campaign, where the Union went on the offense down into Richmond, General McClellan was in charge of the Army of the North, otherwise known as the Army of the Potomac. And although he continued to request for reinforcements, and he always felt like he was being shortchanged, he basically had to withdraw and failed at that mission, and he reset back into Washington, D.C., where his headquarters was, and then later came down to prepare for this. So he felt after leaving Richmond that it was most important to protect Washington, D.C. is right across the river. You saw General Lee, and General McClellan employed a detective from Chicago area, Mr. Pinkerton, who provided some very erroneous intelligence reports stating that there was over 150,000 Confederate soldiers waiting just across the Potomac, which was far from anywhere being accurate, but it did work effectively for the South. And I'm going to let Colonel Alexander talk a little bit about what General Lee did starting in September and why they pushed out of Virginia leading up to the direction where they marched up towards Harper's Ferry and here in Antietam.
So just a little bit about General Lee, a graduate of West Point. He was second in his class, as was George B. McClellan. Both are second in their class, graduating different years. But the thing that's significant about Robert E. Lee is that he served in the Mexican War, in the drive on Mexico City, and was actually breveted 3 times during that conflict for his bravery against the Mexicans, against the enemy. He then went out west and actually participated in some Indian fighting, some patrolling out west. So he had that experience as well under his belt. what people forget a lot of times is that General Lee was a commander in 1857 with a company of Marines at Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, that captured the abolitionist John Brown, who was subsequently hanged by the U.S. government. And Robert E. Lee led that event to capture John Brown. As the war began, Robert E. Lee had a brief stint of command out west, and then came back to the capital of Richmond, Virginia, to be Jefferson Davis' lead military advisor. In the summer of 1862, as McClellan's forces come up the peninsula from Yorktown, pressing on the capital of Richmond, President Davis turns over command of the Army of Northern Virginia to Robert E. Lee. And from then, really from then on, in the rest of the Civil War, the legend is born. It's important to note that both of these West Point graduates, opposing forces, had different leadership styles, and Fred will talk about that and what happened there at the Battle of the 7 Days. But suffice it to say that McClellan was very hesitant, always asking for reinforcements, always asking for more, never having enough. And Lee was very audacious. He was a maneuverist and maneuvered against McClellan at the 7 Days to a point where McClellan was stymied, progress was halted, and forced the Army of the Potomac back down the peninsula. They reboarded their ships and returned back to Washington. The 7 Days is significant, I think, in a couple of ways for setting the scene for what happens later on at Second Manassas and Antietam, and that's the audacity and the aggressiveness of the Army of Northern Virginia. The peninsula, the 7 Days that today is Highway 64 and leads down to Norfolk, Virginia, is not a good road. There are very few roads, and it's basically littered with swamps. The terrain is very inaccessible and makes movement very difficult. And the reason that I bring that up is that Robert E. Lee was always a very renowned student of the terrain, and that plays out here at Antietam. It plays out at Fredericksburg. It plays out at Chancellorsville, and even to some extent at Gettysburg later on. So in the fall of 1862, the Second Battle of Manassas occurs in late August, and General Pope from the Federal side is defeated at the Battle of Second Manassas, and that remains a key junction, not only for the railroads, but it's also a supply depot. So the Army of the Potomac loses that key junction really for the second time. They lost at the First Battle of Manassas and now the Second Battle of Manassas. And that really provides a victory, an impetus for the Confederate States to do a couple of things. It keeps the Army of Northern Virginia poised to be on the offensive, and it also positions the Confederate States of America to garner the support of the European powers, primarily Great Britain, but also France, who are kind of waiting in the wings to see if they are going to fully support or throw all in with the southern states based on their propensity to be victorious against the Federals on the battlefield. So in following the Battle of Manassas, Lee devises a plan with Jefferson Davis to go on the offensive into the north, and his objective is to proceed into Maryland, all the way to Hagerstown. His ultimate objective really is to reach the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, where he might cut some of the rail lines across the Susquehanna River, and which would impede the federal forces and open the route to taking Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington. So this is Lee's grand plan, and sets out to also resupply some very depleted items that his force does not have, mainly food. Shoes become an issue, but really foodstuffs that have been depleted in the Shenandoah Valley based on Stonewall Jackson's success there. So in September of 1862, General Lee's plan is approved by Jefferson Davis, and Lee crosses the Potomac River and heads to Frederick, Maryland, where he then writes Special Order 191, and that outlines his plan for the campaign. He's to send General Longstreet to the town of Hagerstown, where he'll provide action in the north. Jeb Stuart and his cavalry will screen in the east, and meanwhile, General Stonewall Jackson will recross the Potomac and take the Federal Supply Depot at Harper's Ferry. So this is Robert E. Lee's plan for his invasion, his first invasion, what comes to be his first invasion of the North.
And as was mentioned, at the Battle of Second Manassas, General Pope, the Federal commander who had failed there, was requested by General Pope, to have reinforcements, which were approved, and those reinforcements came in the form of General McClellan. But General McClellan intentionally, very deliberately delayed, almost not wanting to go, and there was numerous requests, and he was basically besieged, General Pope, and had to go into full retreat until he had a passage of lines where McClellan finally allowed Pope to withdraw through his forces. But that was that particular battle at Second Manassas set the backdrop for many military and civilian leaders in what was the War Department down on 17th in Pennsylvania, just down the street. President Lincoln would often go down there to personally observe and on a daily basis each afternoon to see what was going on and to receive the telegraphs and get updated on the war, to know how things were going. And General Halleck, the General-in-Chief of the War Department, as well as Secretary of War Scranton, they had a lot of resentment for how McClellan failed to take decisive action and reinforce Pope. And there was many leaders in Washington that were seeking to relieve McClellan. And that did set the backdrop just before this action, until it was the decision of President Lincoln himself, who personally met face-to-face with General McClellan and did decide that he was going to keep him in charge of the Army, as the Army was they had two situations going on: the threat against Washington, D.C., which was viewed by some as the most strategic, that Washington, D.C. could not fall because they did see rebel armies just across the Potomac River, right on the other side of the banks. Some had actually even crossed into Washington, D.C. and antagonized and had freedom of movement to a degree. So, but the order was given, and McClellan was given command of 6 corps, approximately 87,000 Federal soldiers. And as the beginning of September moved, where General Lee was pushing northwest crossing the Potomac and moving into Maryland in the direction towards Harper's Ferry, General McClellan then moved out in pursuit, and this battle then did occur at Antietam with some skirmishes before the main fight, but they were very few and brief. But the main fight did occur starting at dawn on the morning of 17 September 1862, which is where we will move to next, so you can see the morning of 17 September, how it unfolded on the battlefield in the vicinity of Dunker Church.
I think one more comment I mentioned earlier about the Special Order 191, which outlined Lee's plans of how he was going to conduct the invasion and exactly what his division commanders were going to execute over the course of this invasion. It like I stated before, it had General Longstreet in Hagerstown, and General Jackson would then proceed back across the Potomac River and lay siege to Harper's Ferry, effectively cutting off the rail lines that connected the Federals to the west. Prior to this happening, as Lee's forces vacate Frederick, Maryland, to assume their positions in Hagerstown and Stonewall Jackson moving to Harper's Ferry, one of the general orders issued to all division commanders in Lee's army was left behind in a campsite. General Meade, federal forces find this general order wrapped in 3 cigars, and they promulgate and disseminate that order to the rest of the Union Army, directly to McClellan, so that he knows Lee's battle plan. This is very unfortunate, obviously, for the Army of Northern Virginia, but the Southern Wireless is so well connected, even in Maryland, which is one of Lee's objectives, to gain support from the Marylanders to come join the Confederacy. The Southern Wireless is so strong that Lee finds out also within hours that he's been compromised. And so he understands that he needs to revise his battle plan and take some of Longstreet's divisions while Jackson has already been dispatched to Harper's Ferry. Longstreet is to take several of his divisions and plug key gaps in a terrain feature known as South Mountain. Fox Gap, Turner's Gap, and Crampton's Gap are all occupied within 24 hours by the Confederate forces in order to prevent McClellan from dividing the Army of Northern Virginia. This is a key point as a preamble to the battle, because had Longstreet not been able to plug those gaps in the South Mountain, the Federal forces could have split the Army of Northern Virginia in two, Jackson and Longstreet, and defeated them in detail. So this is an important action on the 15th of September that happens at South Mountain, and from there, the Confederate forces will fall back to their most advantageous position and terrain at Antietam Creek in the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Here at the battlefield of Sharpsburg, it's a morning of 17 September 1862. As we look towards the north, you'll see in front of me the Cornfield, as it's known, which will incur about 8,000 casualties in 3 hours as the battle commences. To the far north, you'll see the north, what's known as the North Woods, where the Union Federal forces are arrayed. Here to my left, to the west, is Dunker Church, the site of General Jackson's forces, where they are arrayed. And then as you pan back to the other side of the battlefield, North Woods forward, and the Cornfield, the East Woods here to your right, my left, and the Mumma farmhouse, which will be set on fire here opening elements of the battle. Further to the east, you have the Antietam Heights and Antietam Creek, which is in the low ground down below. The heights are significant because that's where the federal forces have positioned their Parrott guns, their artillery, long-range artillery, and that will have an impact here at the opening stages of the battle. To the south is the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland itself, site of General Lee's headquarters. And also to the south here is General Longstreet's forces that are positioned in the morning of September 17th, ready to engage in battle. The opening salvos of the Battle of Antietam commenced just after sunrise between two primary Confederate batteries located here at Dunkard Church and also just out of view in the West Woods in a place called Nicodemus Hill. An artillery battle and artillery engagement opens the Battle of Antietam. So here in the morning of September 17th, 1862, I have arrayed my forces in such a way to counter the current federal advance coming from the east. As a backdrop, 48 hours earlier, my forces were split. General Longstreet was in Hagerstown, and General Stonewall Jackson was currently engaged at Harper's Ferry, taking the Union munitions and capturing that important federal location just a few days ago. What I needed to do, as McClellan was starting to press and desiring to split my army, split Jackson and split Longstreet, I had to engage his forces at South Mountain here further to the east, and did that on the 15th of September. That allowed me time to consolidate my forces, bringing General Longstreet south from Hagerstown and bringing General Jackson north from Harper's Ferry, leaving a small contingent to handle the prisoners and the munitions and stores located at Harper's Ferry. So this morning, as the sun rises, I have my two main elements under Longstreet and Jackson arrayed here in the West Woods, and positioned here on the high ground at Dunkard Church and also Nicodemus Hill, prepared to engage the Federals as they push south.
I'm General McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac, and earlier this year we had done an offensive against General Lee's army, in the Peninsula campaign, fighting down in Richmond. At this time, General Lee has gone on the offensive and pushed across into Union territory. We have, although I thought it was very important to secure Washington, D.C. so that Washington would not be lost, I have now came after to fight General Lee here in Maryland. In doing so, my forces are to the east of General Lee's, and in a lucky stroke of luck earlier this month in September, two of my young soldiers were able to find Special Order number 191 of General Lee's, which allowed me a tactical advantage knowing that he had split his force and was going after a very strategic point in Harper's Ferry, where the railroads were reinforcing the Union war effort out to the west, as well as he was positioning his force in the vicinity of Sharpsburg. And it was my desire to exploit this while we had the opportunity, but I wanted to do so very cautiously and not risk. I have 6 corps, approximately 87,000 soldiers in this fight. And as I'm pushing from Washington very deliberately, my forces are currently on the morning of 17 September. We are on the east side of Antietam Creek, which is east of Sharpsburg, and my lead corps is right here to the north, and that is General Joe Hooker and his men on the very north side in the North Woods on the morning here at dawn on 17 September 1862.
In response to the mistake of having revealed the intelligence of Special Order 191, which I sent to all of my division commanders, one of those orders was left rolled in 3 cigars in Frederick, Maryland, just over South Mountain on the other side here. Once that was discovered by the federal forces, McClellan attempted to move rapidly, although, like he normally does, had several delays and was not aggressive enough. What that did was allow me to take some of my forces from Longstreet's element and plug 3 key gaps in the South Mountain: Crampton's Gap, Turner's Gap, and Fox's Gap. And I was able to do that within about 12 hours, push those formations up into those gaps and allow them to conduct a holding action while Longstreet's forces were able to retract on Sharpsburg, meanwhile bringing Jackson up from Harper's Ferry. So now I'm able to consolidate based on McClellan's really inaction or lack of aggressive action to consolidate his forces and get to Sharpsburg, splitting the Confederate Army. I'm able to now consolidate, reorganize, and prepare to take on the federal attack.
Prior to the morning of 17 September, there had been a few skirmishes between our armies. I wanted to know exactly where that main body was, and I knew General Stonewall Jackson was a very avid and tactical general who knew his business, and I wanted to find out his location and the disposition very cautiously. We did not know exactly where that was on the morning of the 17th, but here at dawn, in these fields right here, again, General Hooker of my 1st Corps was on the very north side of this battlefield at what we call the North Woods, to our direct north as you're looking at it now. That morning, as the sun rose, as it is now, we had good visibility of the battlefield, and we saw the rebels in plain daylight as the sun came up, as it is doing now. We were engaged, and although I did not give orders for General Hooker to engage, he had no other option, as he was being hit with artillery that will be described here by General Lee.
So at the outset, and focused here on the West Woods, and just beyond the high ground to my left is Nicodemus Hill. Nicodemus Hill and Dunkard Church both have batteries arrayed in front of them, and they commence firing at Hooker's forces as the sun comes up. This is an extremely intensive artillery duel, as the federal forces located on Antietam Heights with their rifled Parrott guns are firing across the battlefield and engaging my artillery in these 2 locations. At this point in the battle, goes on for quite a while, and it's known as an artillery hell. It's an artillery duel between the Federals and the Confederates at Dunkard Church and Nicodemus Hill. Meanwhile, the infantry are beginning to converge and engage just north of here in an area known as the Cornfield.
I did not choose to bring my artillery in close, and I did not choose to mass my artillery at the onset of this engagement. As mentioned, I kept my artillery, which had longer range capabilities since it was rifled. I kept them further away, out by Antietam Hill to the east of Antietam Creek, where they could range. And that morning, we were also able to see, but the Union was not the first to fire. The rebels fired on us General Hooker, conducted his advance right into, this was one of many cornfields, but this was the main battleground for the first 3 hours of our fighting on the morning of the 17th. And we were engaged, from artillery from where we stand here in the south, the rebel artillery, as well as on Nicodemus Hill. They started engaging Hooker's men, and he moved out of the hill, the vegetation area we call the North Woods, and we also had additional soldiers inside the East Woods to my right here that were providing fire, to cover Hooker's advance directly in the main cornfield as we started engaging force on force, soldier against soldier, in a very bloody battle against infantrymen to our direct front. And that morning, it was soldiers being cut down by artillery and rifle fire face to face at very close range.
It's important to note as well that on both sides, but for the Confederates as well, each soldier has about 40 rounds of ammunition. This ammunition is expended very rapidly, and before long, we're having to resupply the front lines with fresh ammunition. The amount of ammunition that is expended here in the first 3 hours is really unfathomable. The other thing that I'd like to point out, as far as my Confederates being able to take advantage and having the advantage of the defense, having set up here in Sharpsburg, or just north of Sharpsburg, is key. We stand on the high ground. We have the high ground. As you look towards the cornfield, you can see how the terrain, the micro-terrain, really drive almost to a valley all the way to the North Woods. So we're going to take advantage of this and position our troops. Jackson's going to position his troops. He's going to push forward out here towards the Mumma Farm, and we're going to set that on fire so that the federal forces don't have a place to hide. It's just one less place for them to take shelter and engage us. But we're going to take advantage of all the high ground, all the elevated micro terrain on this part of the battlefield, so that we can inflict, use mass our firepower and inflict maximum damage on Hooker's forces as they come south.
General McClellan did not know, again, exactly where that main element of General Lee's was, so I set up in Prize Farm. It's on the east side of the Antietam Creek here, and I was relying upon a signals element to provide me information, from their observation of the battlefield via flags from my position, where I could direct the rest of my corps, of the 6 corps, to engage. This morning, General Hooker was engaged with our 1st Corps directly to the north, but I still did not know enough information about where Lee, as well as the rest of his forces, would be, and if there were any more that could reinforce. So I very cautiously was receiving information from General Hooker as he was engaged on his disposition in the bloody fight that he had. He was requesting reinforcements immediately, but I did not want to push those reinforcements to him too soon. I also did not want to, commit my artillery, too much of it, too soon. I wanted to hold it into reserve. Eventually, it was discovered that Lee's army decisively engaged us here in the cornfields. It became very bloody, and I decided to push another corps from General Mansfield to reinforce here this morning as General Hooker and his men became decisively engaged, and also General Hooker became wounded. It was important at that time to be cautious and engage with a 2nd Corps to engage right here in the main battle space that morning of the cornfields. And Mansfield came in to do a battle handover and reinforce and lead the attack into the cornfield that morning.
So the fight is getting pretty desperate in the cornfield. I've set up my headquarters down here just outside of Sharpsburg, where I've also posted my reserve of 2 divisions. The important thing about the way I've been able to use this terrain here at Antietam is it gives me what we call the advantage of interior lines. In other words, because I occupy such a small and short front, I can reinforce at any point on the battlefield really within minutes. I can push a division left to my right flank, to my left flank. I can react very quickly, whereas McClellan and his federal troops have to cross a water obstacle, that being Antietam Creek. They have to go up and around. They have to negotiate some fairly difficult terrain coming out of the creek bed. It's just much easier for me commanding the high ground and being able to reinforce the battle where I see fit, where I see we're having trouble. At this point right now, a desperate fighting in the cornfield, I've asked one of my division commanders, John Bell Hood, to conduct a counterattack and push the Union forces back before they can reinforce with really not just more divisions but more corps that I know are coming.
That morning of the 17th, early in the morning, I told all my corps commanders to stand up at dawn and to ready their men for the fight. But I did not give them orders to advance. Some of my generals I brought to Prize Farm, where I'm at, and had them patiently wait with me to see how the battle would unfold. As it was just mentioned, Antietam Creek, which is, to my left, to your right, here to the east, was a significant water obstacle that had open terrain on both sides, but especially to the east, that we had to negotiate to cross our corps. There are 3 bridges, but those I assumed not just were obstacles, but they were covered by General Lee. So I sent an engineer unit to look at fording sites along this river so that I could push those corps through at a time and a place that would give us the advantage. But again, I did not want to waste the corps by bringing them or artillery across into the battle space until a time and a place which I knew, as I did know, that this cornfield right here was a very wide open area, and it would just be a bloodbath unless I knew more of what was going on in this time. So as I pushed the 2nd Corps of General Mansfield in to reinforce, I utilized this area over here, the East Woods, to push several specialized units that were mountain men, very well-trained sharpshooters, and they produced heavy casualties on the rebels right here in the cornfields. But again, both of our armies carried a standard load for the typical soldier of 40 rounds. So although they had very high accurate rounds being shot at the rebels, they ran out of ammunition very quickly. In this area this morning, the total casualties in those first 3 hours of wounded and killed were from both sides were approximately 8,000 within the first 3 hours. Those that went onto the battlefield on the northern side was approximately 67% casualties this morning here in the cornfield, and also 60% on the southern side. So is these pictures that you see of the historic site of these dead soldiers from both sides, that is what both the Union and the Southern armies are fighting against, and they're actually being, as reinforcements are being pushed in, there's fighting over dead bodies. People are trying to withdraw, and they're just getting cut down by artillery and infantry fire right here in this main battle space of the cornfields. This key terrain is what General Lee had used to set up with one of his firing positions for his artillery batteries. He had used closer in small artillery with 3 pounds and 6 pound artilleries set up in this position called the Dunker Church, which is the area to my left, to the west here, and that is the actual Dunker Church, which ironically this was primarily a German settlement that believed in the Baptist form of religion and dunking by full immersion, which is why they called this the Dunker Church.
Being located here, just across the Hagerstown Road from Dunker Church, and being at the site of where I placed one of my artillery batteries for the opening attack, just explain some of the field pieces here that we have. We've got the 6 pounder, the Napoleon 12 pounder, a 3-inch ordnance rifle, and then a 10 pounder here on the end, a Parrott rifle that was used for long range engagements. It's important to note that the Parrott rifles, Parrott guns are rifled, whereas the Napoleons are smoothbore. What we're looking at as far as a range is of about 1 mile, and fire a number of different munitions. Solid shot, which is just that solid, dense lead that's just going to plow through whatever formation it runs into, taking off legs of horses, basically knocking men down like bowling balls. And then you've got your shot round, which is on a fuse. It is gonna explode. And then finally, one of the more effective rounds used here and other places is canister or grape shot, and that's used normally at close range, within a couple of 100 yards of the enemy, and they fire basically a round that shoots out a number of mini balls, ball bearings, that just slices through large formations of infantry, causing maximum damage, in maximum death and destruction.
The first 3 hours of the fighting, the morning of the 17th, occurred right here. We are not just in the cornfield in the center of the fighting, but the reference point, this is Miller's farm. In this area that we are standing in is the actual cornfields. As at that time, the corn was not harvested, it was still tall, but this became the brutal savagery. Had one of my colonels in the confusion, Colonel Christian, was actually had lost his mind and retreated, which at that point, that occurred with many infantry soldiers on both sides, but not, and it was unforgiving for an officer to retreat as he did. But in this area, as north met south, thousands lay dead. Our weaponry at this time was accurate out to 300 meters. So people were accurately being engaged with artillery in this area, as well as rifle fire. And then it got down to 100 meters, even 30. And people were swinging musket butts and using bayonets on each other at close range, killing them hand to hand right here in this brutal, savage area as Hooker's forces were being decimated. And then I pushed General Mansfield to reinforce it. The rebel army kept advancing very savage, and it was back and forth all morning and actually all day long here, right here in the main central fighting area in the cornfields.
General McClellan saw the same thing, or his commander saw the same thing that I did, is just a back and forth throughout the cornfield, and a site that is I'm not sure anybody can really describe it. The impact of this location here, And like it was said earlier, while it's quiet now, on that day was just stacks and rows upon rows of bodies just standing where they fell, almost in straight line, stacked like cordwood in some cases. And the cornfield changes hands several times. As General Lee, as myself, I realize that I hold the advantage of the terrain, that I hold the high ground. And here towards the west, west of Miller's Farm, just outside of your view, is a hill probably about half a mile away called Nicodemus Hill, which is where one of my commanders, Jeb Stewart, has his horse artillery. The feeling you get standing here in the cornfield right now is that you are, if I'm headed south, if I'm headed towards Sharpsburg, if I'm headed through the cornfield, as Hooker's corps was, I'm immediately subject to enfilade fire, fire from the west here from Stewart's cannons, and that's exactly what they did. Until Union artillery could be brought up and truly oppose it or take control of this terrain, it was a literal bloodbath of shot and shell. And so what I'd like to do now is to move through the cornfield and head over to the east woods, where it was a subject of several attacks and counterattacks by both the Federal and Confederate forces. Talk about some of the details and some of the actions that occurred within the east woods.
Before we depart, this area is where two of the Union generals, both General Joe Hooker, riding on his white horse, was shot in the foot and had to be withdrawn from the battlefield. And then the 12th Corps commander, General Mansfield, was also wounded right here. So as reinforcements came in from Mansfield's 12th Corps, they were taking over and seeing dead bodies. This was not just the bloodiest day in American history, but this central area right here in the cornfields was where most of that mass casualties occurred. And as forces from both sides, as General Hooker had pushed all the way south on his white horse, it appeared, but I did not want to immediately reinforce in this area until I knew for sure. But later, we were driven back. The rebels did fight very viciously, and there certainly was a fog of war. So I did not know how it would turn out or where to engage that main body, and I wanted more certainty to push other corps, from the east, to engage in the Sharpsburg area. I wanted to know more information.
I think it's also worth mentioning, since we're talking about the amount of casualties, the amount of dead, and the amount of wounded that are lying in the field right now, it's important to note that because the fighting is raging so horribly, no one has control of the ground. Therefore, the wounded, unless they're ambulatory and able to evacuate themselves, the wounded are not evacuated here in the cornfield, not for several hours. It's also important to note that that back here, just behind us, just north in the north woods, is located a federal asset, if you will, named Clara Barton, and she goes on to found the American Red Cross. But Clara Barton is here at the battle, providing solace, providing medicines, really from non-volunteer organizations on the federal side to assist in the wounded. The use of chloroform, obviously a lot of amputations that are going on here to save a limb. If the soldiers are gut shot, they're most likely going to die, and most of them are going to die later on from infection or disease. Following the battle, that's where a number of the casualties come from. But it's important to note here at Antietam, what they attempt to do, although they are unable to do it here at the Cornfield for quite a while, is to have an evacuation standard. And that evacuation standard, in comparison, at the first Battle of Bull Run, the federal ambulances were really slow and non-existent at the Battle of Bull Run. First Battle of Bull Run, they basically didn't have their standard operating procedures together of how they were going to evacuate or address mass casualties. But a year later, by the second Battle of Bull Run, where it took 4 days in the first battle to really evacuate the wounded effectively, they have it down to within a 24-hour period. And that becomes a standard for the rest of the Civil War, that they will evacuate wounded off that battlefield within a 24-hour period, which actually kind of goes to our, the current standard in combat now is what we call the golden hour. So it gives you an idea of how wounded are evacuated off the battlefield, and the concern that commanders have for getting those wounded soldiers off the battlefield in a timely manner so they can be treated, in this case with whatever they have and attended to for amputation or follow-on care, wherever that might be.
One other point let's talk about is some of the battles that the American armies had fought previous to this, such as the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. Those were against foreign forces, where this was American against American. The Nicodemus Farm, that morning, artillery was fought, hit in the vicinity of the farm. Actually, women and children who were occupying that area from Maryland, who were hiding in that underground area, came running out. And you saw that both sides had the dignity to not just run to the rescue of these civilians, but the other side to cease firing artillery and not endanger the civilian lives of those women and children. So there was that standard, as in previous wars that the American Army had fought. There was not such chivalry, but we did not fire in these cases on women and children from both sides out of the respect of their non-combatant status.
So here we are, basically in the middle of the cornfield, looking towards the east. You can see down here at the end of the road the Mumma Farm. I had two Confederate divisions pushed here up at Mumma Farm in order to provide early warning and engage the Federals as they came out of the East Woods. The East Woods here to my right, your left, is where the Federal Corps had staged themselves. It offers some good cover and concealment, obviously from the trees, but it's also some very good micro-terrain, some hollows, some folds in the ground where troops are actually able to prepare before the actual push into the assault across the field here towards the West Woods and Dunkard Church. So at this point in the battle in the morning, I have two divisions that are positioned here along the road and at the Mumma Farm. They take the initiative to burn the Mumma Farm in order to prevent Federal sharpshooters from occupying the second deck of that farmhouse and thereby having an advantage of both observation and fields of fire. What happens here in the East Woods, because it does offer cover and concealment for those troops that are inside, is it becomes very important to me and to General Jackson that we're actually able to take the East Woods and establish a firm foothold. What that will do for me, if I can gain the advantage of the East Wood, is I can further delay the Federal advance, but I can also, on the other side of the East Wood, have observation and fields of fire of what the federal forces are doing as they cross at the various Middle Bridge and North Bridge across Antietam Creek. So it is a key piece of terrain in the battle, and I endeavor to send my forces and continue to reinforce the Confederate forces in the East Woods to maintain possession of that. At this hour, the field has changed hands several times. Wounded on both sides, dead and dying on both sides continue. But at this point, in consultation with General Jackson, I am determined to commit one of General Jackson's reserve, which he does under John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood will come across the field, will come across the cornfield towards the Mumma Farm, past Dunkard Church, and he will assault into the East Woods, causing a lot of confusion, a lot of disarray of the Federal forces. But he does not have neither enough ammunition or enough mass to hold on to the Westwood or to the East Woods for long enough and truly establish a foothold before he himself is counterattacked by the Federal forces.
This area that we are standing in here in the Cornfields, again today, 2017, it's a cool winter day. Looks very peaceful, as many battlefields do. But on the 17th of September, 1862, this, just like Stephen Sears' book, Landscape Painted Red, was a scene of savagery. Dead Americans on both sides laid here. Reinforcements on both sides had surged in from both the Federal and the Rebel side. Carnage struck the fear in the hearts of men. And as had just been explained, the area here to our rear in the East Woods, and whoever held that had key terrain, and that provided concealment and a support by fire position to where whoever owned that could fire to their west in suppress and kill very accurately anyone to the main battlefield, as well as it provided indications and warning for what lay on the other side. So it's very important for the Southern Army, as they wanted that, so they knew if we were going to push across on the Federal side. And I was also looking to have the preponderance of my forces, which was still on the east side of Antietam Creek. I had to cross this water obstacle. I also wanted to seize and hold the East Woods as well for those two purposes, to assault General Lee's army, as well as to seize that area to be able to bring my force across Antietam Creek at one of several places where I had the preponderance of, I still had 4 corps that were not engaged here, and I wanted to bring those across, as I gave orders that morning to do to all my generals, to prepare to advance across and move to the west of Antietam Creek. One item that's important, as I mentioned before, was pushing south with a 1st Corps as well as in the 12th Corps. We had the Pennsylvanian, the mountain men firing. Those sharpshooters did a very accurate job, but they ran out of ammunition very quickly. And that was a key point in this battle, was the importance of the logistics, and whoever owned the logistics was able to decisively, gain the advantage here this morning. And on the Federal side, we did have better equipment, ammunition more readily available, as well as the men were fed better here in our own Union soil. One of the things General McClellan had been criticized for was, although the men were better equipped and operating on Union soil, those men also were not, they were not reinforced when the generals who were fighting on the battlefield had requested. Again, Lee had his men given that initiative to do what they wanted, and then he saw those opportunities where McClellan was not reinforcing, was being timid and indecisive, Lee would plug those gaps, and that's why with a smaller force, it did go back and forth. First, Hooker pushed all the way to the south of the cornfield, and then, with the southern reinforcements, Lee's army gained, and it went back and forth several times that morning.
Yeah. So again, it goes back to us being able to take advantage of the terrain. And these things are deliberate decisions by commanders. They're deliberate decisions by myself, by Longstreet, by Jackson, to occupy key terrain on the battlefield, which will afford us a future opportunity to move our troops freely, really in short order, across a half a mile to a mile of ground, while McClellan's troops are having to cross a water obstacle at Antietam Creek, and moving over the course of really 2 or 3 miles to get their forces into position. So I do have an advantage of terrain, and I'm trying to, at this point in the battle, I have trying to exploit that here in the East Woods. So I've ordered John Bell Hood to come up and counterattack into the East Woods near the Mumma Farm, in an effort to hold and seize this ground. One of the things that's important, as just talked about, is logistics. That was one of many reasons for our foray invasion into Maryland several days ago, but it was also to really try and take advantage of what I hoped to be Southern sympathizers here in the state of Maryland. Had we been able to garner that support here in Maryland and gain Maryland's support for the Confederacy, I really believe that that would also incur the support of foreign powers such as Great Britain and France, which is something that Jefferson Davis down in Richmond desperately needs. We desperately need the support of the European powers in order to continue the war. So that bleeds into one of the advantages of coming into Maryland from Virginia, is that we're also afforded the opportunity to take advantage of some of the foodstuffs, some of the crops that they have here, as it has been unadulterated by war to this point in 1862. So we are enjoying some of the harvest, so to speak, of foodstuffs, as previously, before crossing into Maryland, our Confederate troops really lived on green corn and green apples. And I think everybody knows what that does to your digestive tract. So it has not been, food has been short, and so that's one of the motivations for bringing the Army of Northern Virginia here, is to also resupply. And we look for the munitions and stores that we obtain from capturing Harper's Ferry, to be able to take advantage of those and refit and rearm the Army of Northern Virginia. So this is a decisive battle for us. In that winning here at Antietam, we think that it might tip the scales for European intervention into the war on behalf of the southern states.
The Northern Army also knew that the South did want that victory and did want support from either France or Germany, and we wanted to stop this. As General McClellan was receiving from his signals element, that what was occurring here on the main battle space in the morning, he did send, at the middle of the day, he sent off a telegraph back to Washington, D.C. And the War Department received it there. General Halleck, as well as the Secretary of War, Mr. Scranton, received the telegraph from McClellan that he wanted reinforcements, sending everything as quickly as he could, as he said that he is being decisively engaged and that he had had his first 2 corps commanders wounded and evacuated from the battlefield. Now, as we talk from the strategic back down to the tactical, of what was also going on here. One of the elements, especially in this battle, that is unique is the close proximity and the mass concentration of forces that occurred that morning. As we saw in no battles before this, we had the Union Army with approximately 87,000. During this battle, the Southern Army, the rebels, had approximately 57,000, all converging here in the Sharpsburg area at some point in time over this 24-hour period. One of the things that was caused is what many who have combat veterans understand is the fog of war. And what happened here several times on both sides was friendly fire. It happened as the fog burnt off. There was smoke from cannon, smoke from musket fire, and smoke from small fires that were burnt from the crops that were burning from the incendiary cannon. This caused some people to fire on each other. This caused confusion. As my 12th Corps commander, continued to push in, he rode in on his horse, telling his forces not to fire, that those were our own forces, when indeed the troops on the ground saw that they were rebels. They could visually identify that there was rebels. So this was mass confusion throughout the morning here, with a high concentration, the obscuration from fires that were burning in the close proximity, and some of this micro terrain that some wonder why you just cannot get online and decisively engage is these hills roll in, and the east woods provide that cover and concealment to provide those fires. It was a lot of chaos and confusion as reinforcements were surged in from both sides, them stepping over mounds and mounds of dead bodies. As the troops began to run out of ammunition, it did create a lot of fear in the hearts of men on both sides. And that is what had occurred here in a couple different specific units.
So those are great points and worth mentioning. As the fighting becomes so close at hand, it talked about the Union sharpshooters, Berdan sharpshooters here in the East Woods, and it's important to talk about it from a targeting aspect, in that what these sharpshooters, who are they actually engaging? And I would offer to you that the sharpshooters are engaging leaders. So they're engaging those officers with swords held overhead that are basically leading a charge. At this point, they're probably not on horseback; they're on foot, but they are leading from the front, which is an important aspect for any leader. But you can imagine here using Napoleonic tactics with the leader at the fore leading the charge across the cornfield. It's both impressive and pretty amazing. So those sharpshooters are taking shots at the leadership, who are generally out front. They're also taking shots at the standard bearers, and this goes back to Fred's point on how close the fighting in and what we call blue on blue engagements, where there's some fratricide. And one of the reasons for that is that once the standard bearers are killed or wounded, once that flag goes down, if someone doesn't pick it up, then it is very difficult during an engagement to identify really whose side is who is who. And blue and gray are not that far off a color. And at this point in the war, you still have some units on the Union side that are still wearing at least portions of gray uniforms. So it is not easily identifiable, especially in the heat of battle, really who's who. And you throw cannon fire and smoke and repercussions of the rifles and cannon and the Mumma farmhouse on fire right now under the din of battle. It is very difficult to distinguish exactly who's who on the battlefield amongst the living and dead at this point, as the forces flow back and back and forth.
So starting after the enemy has been engaged for about 3 hours, it's approximately 9:10 when I decided to commit General Sumner to push across in this area that we call the Bloody Lane to reinforce the actions that are going on inside the cornfield directly behind us. What had happened and what General McClellan has through time been criticized for is information delay. And that was what was occurring on the battlefield. Was reported that General Hooker had great success. He was pushing the advance. And so I hesitated on engaging and reinforcing in any other areas immediately. Eventually, that time delay allowed General Lee to exploit those gaps, as I did not immediately reinforce with General Sumner, coming in on this eastern flank. This area to my left is immediately known as the Sunken Road. It became known as the Bloody Lane. And once Hooker had success here, it was quickly unrealized, and the advantage had gone to the rebels as they were able to push, as what happened several times, back and forth, north and south, along the cornfields, as his forces were being reinforced, which he'll discuss here. Eventually, that led me to, push General Sumner's corps, committed my 3rd Corps, this time from the east.
So at about 9:30, as the battle has ebbed and flowed back and forth across the cornfield and the east woods, the Federals now, as McClellan has intended, now become to start to push the issue, and the volume of Federal troops almost becomes too much. Based on that, I take my last bit of reserve that's currently here on the field in General McLaw's division and bring him up out of Sharpsburg and put him in action here to the left, across the top of Dunkard Hill, trying to face the Federal corps that have now been refreshed. That happens. That's successful, but eventually he is beaten back, and the new Federal reserves that are put into the fight are now pressing on Longstreet's corps here to the southern part of the battlefield. In this part of the battlefield lies a sunken road that extends for quite a ways, over 3/4 of a mile, and that's where Longstreet has positioned the preponderance of his forces. I now feel confident that I can hold the West Woods after McLaw's counterattack. I've stabilized that position, but the Federals are still coming now in force, consistently being committed, consistently being put into the fight. So D.H. Hill, as part of Longstreet's forces here at the bend in the road, at the sunken road, which becomes, as Fred said, Bloody Lane, we are now in position. What the Federals don't realize is the advantage that a sunken position has. It's a natural fighting position. In other words, I can stand behind the sunken road and through the railed fences and fire my weapon systems, fire my rifles almost at waist level. So whereas a human being tends to fire high in combat, leading to some occasional headshots, but a lot of misses because it's the natural tendency to fire high. In a defilade position like the sunken road, it allows my troops to have maximum firepower to the front and inflict maximum casualty. Unseen behind the camera to the high ground behind you towards the town of Fredericksburg, or towards the town of Sharpsburg, are positioned the majority of the Confederate reserve artillery, and they will provide overhead fire and overhead support at the advancing Federals as they come across and press on the bloody lane. And they'll also provide a good backstop should any of the lines break for any reason.
Starting at 9:10 in the morning, General Sumner's corps pushed from the east down this road behind us. They pushed across the Antietam Creek into this sunken road, which had become named as the Bloody Lane. So this did provide not just concealment from the rebels, but also provided cover from any fire that from the rifle fire. As was mentioned just previously, these pickets allowed, our Union Army to level their weapons and fire very accurate fire. As I had my soldiers, General Sumner had his soldiers wait until they saw the belt buckles of the rebels, and when they're at that close range, then they could provide very accurate fire right in a very deadly spot, and we just cut down and slaughtered so many rebels. However, shortly after that, we were canalized in this terrain feature, and Captain Thompson's about a quarter mile to my left here fired an enfilade right as we were filling this road, and just cut down. It was his turn to cut down and slaughter us. As you see this beautiful morning here, green, but this was termed the Bloody Lane because of indeed what it was, is we had so many of our men cut down and destroyed by the Confederate artillery fire that those rifled guns of Captain Thompson's laying their artillery fire, hitting us down here where the Confederates' rifles were not able to, and our men began to be slaughtered right here.
Right. So as Second Corps comes across the field in a bunch of different places, the rebel soldiers are waiting here in defilade position, and the same thing applies. They're waiting for the Federal soldiers as they crest the hill and come into the line of fire. The Confederates also wait to the last possible second and unleash their volley fire, cutting down numerous Federal soldiers. In the 3-hour engagement that happens here from 9:30 basically until 1300, even though the battle is raging up there on the ridge, there are 5,500 troops that are either killed or wounded here within the Bloody Lane. It is worth mentioning that two of the Federal divisions, over time, they do become depleted. Their ranks are penetrated, and just as Fred said, once they have penetrated the sunken road and align their forces down the long way, or the enfilade of the long axis of the Bloody Lane, it is absolutely like shooting fish in a barrel, because the Confederates are still then engaged from their front and also now from their flank. And as Matthew Brady's pictures and Gardner's pictures depict after the battle, just men lined up like cordwood, Confederates up and down the Bloody Lane, where they took their last breaths as the Federals moved through. The other thing that's important to know about the Bloody Lane is after the Confederates are pushed out, even though they battle back and counterattack, the same advantage that was afforded the Confederate troops with the Federals coming at them now becomes a Federal advantage as they take up positions as the Confederates withdraw back towards Sharpsburg, back towards the high ground under the protection of their artillery. The Federal soldiers are now able to take up positions of advantage and fire at the retreating Confederates, which also resulted in high casualties for those who had, in this case, turned their backs on the enemy and were in a full retreat to take up positions of more advantage further to the west.
And as some of those rebel positions had been broken by General Sumner's corps. Again, it was very slow, the response time but the 4th Corps of the federal side under General Porter again advanced to reinforce this effort, but at a very slow time. So we had General Porter eventually come in, reinforce General Sumner here, who had been also very devastated. One key point that we learn as military officers is to be able to employ all the assets. And at this stage in the time, without aviation, one of those key assets is that artillery, which General McClellan, although he had 4 corps of 6 committed, he was not committing those artillery assets to support those soldiers and those 4 corps that were already decisively engaged, from just behind us in the Cornfield all the way to the north and west woods. The fighting was very severe, but it was not reinforced with those artillery cannon, that were still on the east side of the Antietam Creek. So that lack of support, that lack of deciding to, commit them in the slow dribble of forces reinforcing, as Colonel Alexander had mentioned, when the rebels had been broken here and withdrew to the south again, that was not immediately exploited, although orders were given by McClellan at dawn to all his generals to stand up. And General Burnside, was, as well as General Sumner, they were all ready to go, but when they were employed, that was where, fault was found so many times that it could have been exploited, and General Lee could have been driven back and crushed and pushed into the Potomac immediately if greater firepower and concentration, as not just the sheer number of sizes with 87,000 federal forces against 55,000, but that delay allowed those rebels who were at Harper's Ferry to continue to push to the west, although they were exhausted, and then they were able to reinforce this effort here to where the Federals no longer had that massive superiority due to the Federals' slow decisions in reinforcing based on needing to know more information and the failure to use overwhelming mass artillery fire support to reinforce the successes when the Union had them. That was given up, and it led to a high casualty rate. The Union in the Cornfields just in the morning was 67% of the forces that entered that Cornfield were casualties, compared to 60% with the Federals or the rebels that had their artillery much closer, and they fully committed their forces.
One of the things that also needs to be brought up is this theory, the theory of combined arms, like Fred has been talking about. But it's worth noting that here at Sharpsburg, I was able to employ my cavalry, right, with Jeb Stewart and his horse artillery up here on my left flank, up there near Nicodemus Hill. I also used the cavalry to scout, to provide early warning to the force, so that if and when we did have to withdraw back across the Potomac, I was well aware of how many troops were being employed against me, and always leaving myself an out. I also used, like I spoke before, using the artillery and the infantry in combination to provide the most effective fires, either in the attack or in the withdrawal. Of note, several thousand horses were killed here at Sharpsburg on that day. At this point, I can't remember the exact number, but several thousand horses were killed. And why this is important is that the horse was the primary maneuver element for the artillery. They were horse-drawn. They towed the caissons. They towed the limbers. So if you were going to move an artillery piece around the battle, you had to have horses. And of course, horses became the target for sharpshooters and for marksmen, picking out some of those key targets, just as they would flag bearers, standard bearers, or officers. In my case, I'm able to protect most of my horses in defilade positions because of the ground, because of the microterrain. And so I'll employ my cannon on the high ground to provide maximum impact and fields of fire. The horses are in defilade and they're being protected. So as the federal troops begin to maneuver or attempt to maneuver their artillery, they begin to have trouble because many of the horses are killed or wounded throughout the day.
And if your vision can, bring to mind what it would be like instead of, this green sunken road, it painted, like Stephen Sears reported, painted a landscape of red. And that's exactly what happened as when General Sumner pushed through and then General Porter's. So we had 4 corps committed. There was an actual, a significant breakthrough and forced the withdrawal of the Confederate forces, but it was not exploited with the artillery. And there was also, what we'll talk about next, is another delay in the Union, not just because of General McClellan's slow timing, but it was actually General Brookside that had a challenge at the water obstacle crossing over Antietam Creek, which we'll talk about next.
And just to give some more context to this portion of the battle, as was mentioned earlier, General A.P. Hill, part of Longstreet's brigade, is handling the federal prisoners and the captured munitions and stores at Harper's Ferry. He's given an order to depart that location, Scotia, and come to reinforce my army here at Sharpsburg as quickly as he can. And as we'll see at Burnside's Bridge, A.P. Hill shows up just in the nick of time. We'll transition to Burnside's Bridge now, where Colonel Toombs and his Georgians, 500 Georgians, are almost single-handedly holding that flank and holding that crossing as Burnside begins to press throughout the morning and begins to have a little bit more success each time.
The morning of the 17th of September, General Burnside, the 5th Corps commander of the Federal Army, received his orders to stand up and prepare his men for the fight on what was the Confederates' right flank in the very south and southeast portion of Sharpsburg, just south of the Cornfield battlefield. But it was several hours, and General Burnside was very impatient to actually receive the execute order, and he paced, incessantly waiting, to push across this terrain feature. This area behind us is the Antietam Creek, where his 5th Corps was. We had a local Maryland resident, Mr. Rohrbacher, who owned this land and also owned the bridge inclusive, which was Rohrbacher's Bridge. And so General Burnside did finally receive the order to go ahead and push through. And as you see from our position here on the west side of the Burnside Bridge, it is very elevated, and this is where the Confederate Army had numerous cannon, which made it very difficult for the advance of Burnside's corps. This was his 5th of 6 federal corps that were being employed, and there was 1 left in reserve with General Porter. So as the backdrop, you can sort of see there is some clearing right back there, but there was actually, in 1862, there was 300 meters east of the bridge that was just raw fields and open that made it extremely difficult for this last advance of the Yankees to push across this thin, narrow bridge and to come in and reinforce and exploit and hopefully push, the rebel army back into the Potomac. So once General Burnside first received this order to go ahead and push, he sent General Rodman's men, and they pushed across the bridge, but 2 of those regiments were repelled and essentially destroyed, not just from the cannon fire from the rebels here on the high ground, but also, from their rifle fires which were pinning them as this man-made feature canalized and trapped them into a very narrow and deadly space. It was also known that General McClellan used his engineer company to locate an area that they could find a narrow and shallow crossing. They found a few of them. One was 5 to 6 feet deep, which General Brookside did not want to get stuck in that as he pushed across. And another one was a little shallower, but it had a 160-foot drop, and then pushing across a shallower portion, which was just to our south. Those were decided not to be utilized, but instead coming across this bridge, it did become just a complete slaughterhouse, as first General Brookside had General Rodman push those regiments, and they were denied. And then General Sturgis was the next in line to lead the charge. And this began a delay that General McClellan ordered 4 times to General Brookside, get your men across, use every means necessary, which General Brookside was making his best effort to do. And a storming party of 670 Federal soldiers stood 300 meters behind, and they lined up 4 abreast, and they charged. And those rebel cannon, it was unknown whether they were used in direct fire mode or indirect fire mode, but they had a devastating effect to the Union Army as they advanced across this Burnside Bridge.
So on the evening of September 16th, Lee, Longstreet, has taken one of his Georgia divisions under the command of Brigadier General Toombs, and they have occupied the high ground here at Burnside's Bridge, at Rohrbach Bridge, in order to prevent the Federals from crossing and falling in on the Confederate flank. So that, as the sun comes up on the morning of the 17th of September, 1862, the Confederates hold this high ground, supported by, like Fred said, with their artillery and 500 Georgians who are all great marksmen, occupying the high ground here above the entrance to what becomes Burnside's Bridge. Just to note that the delay in attack, Toombs Georgians are able to hold off the Federals pretty much all day long, because it's not in earnest till about 1300 that Burnside presses across. I just remind you of what's going on in the rest of the battlefield. They're still fighting and holding there near Dunker Church in the West Woods. We had a huge problem there at Bloody Lane, and both Jackson and Longstreet have pulled their troops back. What is unknown to the Federals at this time is that at 0630 from Harper's Ferry, A.P. Hill and the last division, the last reserve of the Confederate forces, have started their forced march from Harper's Ferry to Sharpsburg, and that's gonna take them from 0630 in the morning on the 17th, and they'll arrive here on the field of battle just in time to reinforce Longstreet and assist in concluding the battle. But what happens here, as was described, is just a very canalized enemy, 4 abreast, going across this very thin bridge. The depth of Antietam Creek at that time, unknown, but it's wide enough, probably 25 yards, to where anyone that's going to get into that water is being overwatched and being engaged by Toombs's Georgians on the high ground.
2 other principles, as was just described, the rebel force, which had just routed the Union Army in Harper's Ferry, as was seen just days prior to this, they had bridges of different construction, wood composition as it spanned across the river. This bridge, however, was made of stone, and it was not as easily able to be scuttled or destroyed. It was not known in our studies and research if they had the explosives to scuttle this bridge or to demolish it or render it less passable, to prevent this from being a passage point for the Union Army to come in and reinforce on the rebel army's right flank. So the second key point we want to talk about at this stage is military science terminology of unity of command. And the 5th Corps was a bit unusual. It was the one corps on the federal side that had Burnside as well as Cox in command, but it was chosen that Burnside would. But McClellan did not seek either as his initial effort. He actually wanted, and he requested the General Hooker, who had been shot previously in the Cornfields, been shot in the foot and had a lot of blood loss. He requested that Hooker take the 5th Corps and make this push. Hooker said he was not up for the fight and took the pass that effort. So they did send Brookside as the main effort. Although he had no troops, Cox was involved, but it was not the standard unity of command of having one commander and subordinate commanders. It was a very awkward relationship from the get-go for the 5th Corps.
I think it's an important point to bring up as well on the Confederate side, where unity of command was achieved, was demanded at all times. And while a lot of these generals knew each other on either side, many of them West Point graduates, many of them VMI graduates, they did know each other, but it's how they all ended up working together. Believe me when I say that the Army of Northern Virginia was not without its faults and without its arguments. They couldn't agree on certain strategies or tactics. In fact, I'll bring a couple of those up. In February of 1862, President Jefferson Davis signed the Conscription Act. What the Conscription Act of 1862 did was it had initially invested Confederate soldiers to fight for 1 year. In 1862, when President Jefferson Davis signed the amendment to the Conscription Act, it obligated each Confederate soldier to be dedicated to this cause for the remainder of the war. And that caused some consternation once General Lee began to cross the Potomac River. There were several Confederates, and perhaps as many as a division's worth, that refused to cross the Potomac River and carry the fight to the north. And so those are some vignettes that there wasn't unity of command full out within the Confederate Army. But once they got into the fight, Robert E. Lee had a very great sense. He was very audacious, but he had a very great sense of what was happening on the ground. He was all about terrain. He was all about mapping the terrain and then make his decision off of how he knew the enemy would move and how he knew his own forces could move. And so that commander's intent carried to Generals Jackson and Longstreet, to A.P. Hill. And so they knew they had a bias for action. They knew that it was time sensitive. There was a sense of urgency on the Confederate side, whether that was out of a sense of survival or a sense to support their brethren. The unity of command on the Confederate side pretty much prevailed throughout the war.
A couple other points in regards to, as now we're closing in on the end of the battle, as this is the last penetration point across the Antietam Creek, is the differences in the commanders. We had General McClellan had a far larger force, but he used the signal corps and stood off more. Although he did approach closer to the lines, he was not engaged in the way that Lee had, who had his headquarters to the southwest of Sharpsburg and Tents. And then during this decisive point here was found. Lee came up to, encourage and motivate the morale of the soldiers face to face right at the point of friction on the front lines. Very different than how General McClellan, who his troops did really appreciate him and they loved him and they were loyal to General McClellan, but he was found much more distant during this particular battle. One other thing is when we talk about a lot of these leaders, especially on the north side, we did not have leaders that was their trait for decades, that were promoted to generals from when they were privates. Oftentimes, they were. You see some career officers that were generals, but many times they were not. Many times they were, as it's recorded in the history of this battle, they were lawyers, they're businessmen, many were doctors, many were politicians. So the difference between we see from now in the modern day to then is you had many, intelligent people in positions of prominence fighting as the key leaders, and some had the prowess and the experiences and, obviously the intellect, and they were successful, and some were not. And some of the lack of success on the tactical level from the men that they led, where some of these forces at different positions on the battlefield were very green. That was their very first encounter, and they saw a lot of carnage on the bloodiest day, in one single day in American history here at the Battle of Sharpsburg and Antietam. This did shock and really impacted the minds of a lot of these, not just young men who decided to retreat, but in this area, as well as in the Bloody Lane, there were, regiments and brigades in one instance that completely turned about-faced and retreated from many different reasons. But there is one last point. Throughout this battle in several different locations, there was reports of often many officers who had been drinking, and from studying the history and the research of that was something that some of the enlisted said was common. And actually, there's a General Ferraro who at this point here basically bribed his men, saying he would give them a larger ration of alcohol if they made it across that bridge, basically risking their lives. And so that was incentivized back in that day. And some soldiers and their leaders were found drunk and actually fell off their horse from reports of being intoxicated, which was also reported was standard in that day and age. But you also have to try to realize, the dealing with so much death, and as a leader who if you're leading a division or a corps, you may not be on the front lines, and you're probably going to survive and go on and fight other battles. The psychological impact that has after several battles of seeing hundreds and thousands of men screaming, and the lack of advanced medical care that we have today is body parts are being blown apart, people are dying and then having to bury them. In this battle, what we saw later in the day, they actually had to have a truce at the end of the day because the fighting and the casualties were so severe to police up the casualties and to bury the dead.
Yeah, it is a good point that Fred brings up about the impact of responsibility, the success of the mission. Yet, the soldiers that died here, and just the overall weight of command, the weight of responsibility that is on one's shoulders, because you are responsible for everything, everything that you do or fail to do, and that's never more true than on the field of battle. And so it is of no surprise that a lot of these officers did turn to alcohol. As a matter of fact, one of the pain-killing drugs that was issued to many of the soldiers that were wounded was laudanum. Laudanum is a current day or former use of an opioid, and it was so rampant post-Civil War throughout the ranks of those survivors that they called it the soldier's disease, and that laudanum was issued to them to cure the pain or probably some of their PTSD as we know it today. And so it was also rampant back then, unfortunately. Of the 21,000 Americans that were killed here, killed or wounded, the casualty is, as we've said before, the highest in American history on one day. All of this took place within 12 hours, if anyone can imagine that. And two things came out at the end of the battle. One was Matthew Brady, who is a renowned photographer and chronicler of Civil War photos and post-Civil War reconstruction, sent Alexander Gardner and a gentleman by the name of Mr. Gibson to record what had happened here at Antietam. And so their photos are very famous, and you'll probably see some more of those in this presentation. But it illustrated the dead in a way that Americans had not seen before, and it really resonated the cost of war in all of our papers throughout the eastern seaboard of the United States in the following months to come. The other thing that came out of Antietam was there were a lot of unknown soldiers. So as you go to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, several thousand soldiers here were left unidentified. And what that did as a result, Antietam did as a result, was to cause an identification system to be accepted by both armies, sometimes in the form of actual metal dog tags. The first dog tags that we see come here from the Civil War. Others would sew their names into the inside of their tunics, so that their bodies could be identified. And that was another, essentially a positive development post Antietam that would carry on for the rest of the war and through the rest of American history.
And so as you can see how it is today, and if you would envision what it was like back, in 1862 here, where this, just like in the main battle area in the Cornfields, there was starting off with cannon fire from both sides, just decimating both sides. But right there on the bridge, where you can see this young woman is walking, that was actually the highest concentration of casualties per square areas. It was recorded during the entire battle as the Confederate artillery was reinforced with the direct fire of the infantrymen fighting and shooting, regiments. And if you could imagine yourself as a Union soldier pushing across, and you're basically stumbling over piles and piles stacked high of dead bodies that before they came across, they were affixed bayonets. So it's a very formidable feature that was not destroyed, leaving it access. But, since they decided not to ford in any other areas, they were really trapped, and it just was an extremely bloody area. But as was mentioned, at 1 p.m. that afternoon, the flag was planted on the west side here of the battlefield. And then after that, Burnside's corps, pushed through, and that led to the eventual rout in the withdrawal of the rebel army.
Okay, we're currently here at the Pry House, the property, 140-acre farm that was commandeered by the Union Army to become General McClellan's headquarters, and also the upstairs and the outlying barn was used as a federal hospital during the battle. It's a location that they occupied for about 2 months following the battle, and was also the site of taking care of about 18,000 wounded or thereabouts that passed through here. Directly to my rear, and looking towards the west, in the distance at about 2 miles or so, a little bit less, you have a direct view of the Mumma Farm, parts of the Cornfield. You can see the east woods further to the right, to the north, and then all the way on the far side, you can see the tops of the trees located in the west woods. So the Pry House is positioned to really view the battle, which is where McClellan viewed most of the battle from, and they communicated with their different corps using a semaphore, a series of flags signaling when to move, where to move, and who to commit. This was not the only semaphore location. Also on Antietam Heights, a place called Elk Ridge, which stands directly above Antietam Creek, was also another location of a communication station or a semaphore station that the Federals used to signal movements and direct troop formations.
General McClellan not only commandeered this home, which was a little bit different than the command post for General Lee, which we'll see next, but it offered a nice stately position, and just to how he fought this battle, it provided him a much greater standoff. And one of the things with the signals elements is there is delays in information, especially with different battlefield obscuration. Everybody wants to think that whether it's a sentry or a signals element, that they're always attentive, always alert. But that's the human factor is that there is delay, there is confusion, and that has an effect. That's a little bit different than when your force is much closer from your command element is much closer, and you can have a rider or a physical messenger that's much more reliable. So there is differences in degradation is from weather, man-made obscuration, and just the human factor of being weary. This location had, as was mentioned, been utilized as a hospital for General Hooker, who was wounded, as he recovered here, as well as General Richardson, who stayed here and actually succumbed to his wounds a month after being shot. There was over 100 field hospitals following the battle that made their best efforts at returning those soldiers back to as great a position as possible. I think the casualties they said they treated in those field hospitals over those periods were approximately 18,000 soldiers were treated in the over 100 field hospitals. Some who have not been in the military service think an odd tactic to just take over a house, but that is, in fact, commonly practiced principle to this day, that people are compensated for the use of their property. And that was what happened in the case with Philip Pry. He did file a claim with the U.S. government, and typical of maybe the IRS today, they investigated Mr. Philip Pry for overcharging the government. But that is a tactic that we do use in today's day and age, where if we need a strategic compound overseas, Iraq, Afghanistan, or some parts unknown, we will commandeer and provide compensation for the residents and occupants of a particular structure that we want to occupy. Behind me is the headquarters for the Union General McClellan. This was used the day prior, as he told Mr. Philip Pry, who owned this property here, that he was to evacuate. And it was approximately 2 miles from the battle space, as we've just discovered and described, that it was used by signals elements to relay information here. One of the things that General McClellan was not able to understand here through the semaphore is the actual impact to his soldiers on the ground. He could understand that, one was pushing forward or one was in retreat, and casualty reports on the battlefield, something that has not been described yet, is the rebel yell and the psychological impact of having, the enemy, in this case, the Confederate Army, who would let out that rebel yell and send shrieks, as well as, the devastation, the blood, the broken bones, the dying, and the wounded, the dead. That is not able to be understood and observed from here, which is very significant on this battlefield, which was the bloodiest day with the mass forces, and especially in places such as the Cornfield, the East Woods, the Bloody Lane, in Burnside Bridge. These were areas that, in the comfort of these homes that General McClellan had here at the Pry Farm, is not able to be understood by the commander.
We're here in the town of Sharpsburg, really less than half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from the Confederate front lines. This is the site of General Robert E. Lee's headquarters. Set up headquarters here for the duration of the battle on this high ground, just outside of town, as it provided a good overlook to be able to command and control both Jackson and Longstreet's movements. Also afforded me the opportunity to have contact with A.P. Hill at Harper's Ferry, and is able to use this position to command and control the battle and afford me a very quick turn, and using the concept of interior lines to move in reserves, reinforce, and also to resupply. Again, General McClellan, located 3 miles away from here on the other side of Antietam Creek, was not afforded the same opportunity, although he had established a series of semaphore posts on both Elk Heights and at the Pry House, and was able to communicate with his troops. I was able to communicate quicker, and therefore able to make decisions quicker, and essentially have an impact on the battle at a time and place of my choosing. Even though the Federal forces were greater in greater number, I was still able to, on the 18th day after battle, sneak back across the Potomac River here, a few miles to my rear, and escape back into Northern Virginia, where the Army of Northern Virginia would refit and rearm and get ready to face the Federal forces again in a couple months' time at Fredericksburg, where we would defeat them once again in turn, this time under the command of General Burnside. Earlier in the battle, General McLaw's division I had held back here in reserve, and once the actions started to pick up in the vicinity of the Cornfield, and then right at the culminating point of the Cornfield, as they began to threaten the Bloody Lane, I was able to pick up and push General McLaw's division up and reinforce General Jackson there just south of the West Woods. What's little known is that General McLaw's division moved out upon my order. However, General McLaw's was asleep in the field behind, had passed out from exhaustion, and was only awakened at the movement of his division directly into combat. In which time he got on his horse and led his division to conduct an essential counterattack against the Federal center.
So, good afternoon, Commandos. Thanks for sticking with us through the battlefield study, and we hope you enjoyed that. There were these were 3 of approximately 5 publications that were the primary resource documents, and the primary being over here on the left. If you want to have a good read, we really recommend an avid, very devout historian named Stephen Sears. He wrote this, and some of you who have been on the battlefield in Gettysburg have read another book. I believe he's written 4 or 5 in total, but he's just the amount of information, I could not put it down. And You can order this on the Go Commando Show. This will be up right next to the episode, so you can go straight there if you're listening on audio or audio video. You just go straight to it. It's Landscape Turn Red by Stephen Sears. These other books are very, very good and very valuable. Antietam, the Soldier's Battle, and then Antietam, Photographic Legacy, which describes a great deal about how two very renowned and prolific photographers really started to shape a different way throughout the rest of the Civil War of how media and imagery were utilized in the mass media to have a huge gripping effect on the citizens of the United States. So these three are great books. And now we'd like to talk to you as a wrap-up, as we've talked about so many different points from the soldier's perspective, the leader's perspective, and then now we want to finalize with some of the differences in the battleship or the battle leadership styles of General Lee and General McClellan. I'll let Colonel Alexander talk briefly first regarding the leadership style as part of this after action of General Lee, and I'll conclude very briefly with General McClellan.
Right. So the conclusion of this battle and the after action found the Confederates retreating back across the Potomac River to consolidate, reorganize, and carry the war for yet several more years in Northern Virginia. In 1863, that next summer, within really 6 months, Lee would return, this time to Pennsylvania, and meet at the crossroads of Gettysburg. But all those battles in between, December would be Fredericksburg, followed by Chancellorsville, two huge victories in both December and then May of 1863, really lead to a healthy position, so to speak, tactical and operational position for the South. Logistically, however, the forces that the Confederates lose here at Antietam really are irreplaceable, and they just keep getting worse over time. The attrition of the Union forces is one thing, but the attrition of the Confederate forces is quite another thing, as they don't have as many to draw from, many troops to draw from, and it ends up having an impact on the Army in Northern Virginia and throughout the rest of the war. A couple things to note about the Battle of Antietam and lessons learned. The Confederates were assigned a one-year contract to serve. In February of 1862, President Jefferson Davis extended that to the remainder of the war. So some of the troops did not take that too well, having served almost a year at that time, only to find out that they were in it, basically in it to win it. So there are some parameters there that are of concern to leadership. But the one thing that I'll say about this battle is the Confederates were extremely well led for a cause that they believed in, for fighting for their states. Many of the regiments were formed from their state, from their town. They fought side by side with their brothers or uncles, or in some cases their fathers. But they were all from a point of knowledge that they would live and die for each other side by side. And you see the carnage that has been left on the battlefield in Antietam, 23,000 killed or wounded. As Fred said, the most costly day in American history. It still is that. 12 hours of fighting that ended with that amount of bloodshed. But the leadership and the and the tactical advantage that the Confederates continued to have throughout the war. Their proclivity for understanding the terrain that they were fighting in, for understanding how they would maneuver and when they would maneuver, the understanding of a commander's intent. They did not necessarily wait for orders, but they understood what Longstreet, Jackson, Lee, A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, all the troops understood what the commander's intent was, what he wanted them to do in the absence of orders, and they executed it very well. And only by numbers and attrition, were they frequently beaten on the battlefield, but they were not outgeneraled. I think the other significant thing about the Army of Northern Virginia is that they were experts at maneuver. Stonewall Jackson's troops in the Shenandoah Valley earlier in 1862 had wreaked havoc on all the Union forces, all the way from Lexington to Winchester and everything in between. His troops were known as the foot cavalry. They would march 15 to 25 miles a day and show up on the Federals' doorstep without any notice. The Federal armies were not as in shape, were not as well trained, and so they were not. They did not have the option of being such maneuverous as did the Army in Northern Virginia, and I think it paid off for Lee in many respects. At the end of the day, like I said, the attrition of forces really was too much, but Lee was smart enough to pull back across the Potomac, refit and rearm, and be ready to fight another day.
And there's an interesting comparison between these two generals that I'd try to distill down in a simple phrase of General Lee had a character of, a humble, very introspective and a deep thinker. And General McClellan, although he could think on a large scale, had an attitude of the exact opposite of humility. It was hubris. Saw himself, and often one of the lessons for those of you in today's day and age, when it comes time to either social media, snail mail, email, he probably didn't know at the time that his letters to his wife Ellen would be a part of American history forever. And one thing in reading all these books, it's, some people just saw his arrogance manifested in many ways besides these letters to his wife. They had several nicknames: the Messiah, Napoleon. Just thought he was God's gift, and many times he, coming off of the Battle of Manassas, decided I should turn into Washington D.C. and take over. Basically, as the presidency. He constantly referred to Secretary Scranton of the War Department as a fool and an idiot and buffoons, and these letters were constant. These were constant terms being addressed to his wife on how he is going to save the Union by leading the Army once again because the president asked him to do it, and basically he's gracing himself. So these are not embellishments that I'm talking about. These are actual words from letters that he described his most loved one, and just a very arrogance. One of the things that you can see that he's not considerate of is his ability to understand how his actions affect others. As in this battle here in Antietam, is he's requesting from Washington, D.C. to send a bit of support they have, knowing that Washington, D.C. is still in threat of rebel forces that are inside and can wreak havoc in Washington, D.C. He, of course, anyone wants those, but not knowing, how that can affect other causes, such as the presidency, which he flip-flopped before, where he thought that the main effort should always be in Washington, D.C. So there is and that is a recurring theme that we saw manifest when McClellan pushed into Yorktown, and that swampland as it was described earlier, just what a mess he was in, and he wanted constant reinforcements instead of understanding how to deal with the situation at hand and put it in proper perspective, that it may be slower moving, but indeed he again requested for everything to be sent to him because he was the most important. That's kind of his vision. As we mentioned previous in this study, several people, after General Pope was basically defeated in the Second Manassas, several of these leaders in Washington, D.C., military and civilian leadership in the War Department, saw that they believed McClellan should not lead anymore, should never command. And that, in fact, is what occurred after the Battle of Antietam on October 3rd, when President Lincoln actually came up here to Antietam, and after meeting, it took several days, but he actually talked, heard the story, and then decided to relieve the General McClellan of his command and put General Burnside in charge. But at that meeting, which you can see in several of these books and the illustrations, is not just General McClellan as well as President Lincoln, but one of his young aides, General George Custer, who was a young man at that time who would move on later to serve as a general, and then later again back as a lieutenant colonel out in the West, where he was soundly defeated. But those actions from here in this battlefield in Antietam likely had effects of seeing a timid commander, such as his former boss that he was the aide for, General McClellan, and him being relieved by the President of the United States for not. All we talked about today on the battlefield was how again and again and again General McClellan woulda, shoulda, coulda, either utilized artillery, utilized more manpower by pushing a corps more rapidly, and if he had communicated and had more accurate information to him and responded to his commanders, it could have been the end of the war right in September of 1862, but he failed to act decisively. He failed to maintain the tempo and initiative that was required, and that's why I believe President Lincoln, who had made a comment at one point in time, if you're not using your army, may I borrow it, because McClellan was just too timid and not engaging the enemy. And here's a president of the United States that would be out on the front lawn of the White House test firing Gatling guns, he wanted this war to end. He was not a man filled with bloodlust. He was an individual who wanted to restore an entire union of the United States, America. And that's what this Battle of Antietam actually led to setting up what was declared by Lincoln later that year as the Emancipation Proclamation. It was because of the Confederate withdrawal here, and what was truly on Lincoln's heart was to abolish slavery, which up to that point had not been stated by the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, but it was something on his mind, and he wanted to add that into what the war effort was truly all about.
It's a great point that two strategic things come out of the Battle of Antietam. Fred just mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation, and I talked earlier about the South's pursuit of European intervention. As a result of the Emancipation Proclamation being issued later on, it turns the tide in the European powers' mind, because slavery is abolished. That they, at that point, once that's issued, they divest themselves from fully supporting the Confederate States of America. So two strategic things really come out of September 17th, 1862, and really begin to shape the rest of the war.
Yes. Thank you again, Commandos. And I want to make sure that everybody is, it's getting colder this time of year. You can get a Go Commando thermos right on the website at gocommandoshow.com. Have the no drip top, pour it right into the cup, and you can get yours right on the Go Commando Show website. Go to the store, and we'll send it out to you immediately. Thank you for supporting the Go Commando Show, and we look forward to our next show.
To all my fellow grunts out there who in your youth felt it was your duty to protect us, I salute you. And thanks to the listeners of the Go Commando Show who labor on the farm, who are sweating on the construction site, putting forth your very best at the office, you are making a difference. Support the Go Commando Show in our pursuit of bringing you the highest quality professionals. Infiltrate the website at gocommandoshow.com, where you can view all of the podcasts and arm your team with incredible deals on health supplements, commando clothing, and equipment. Every time that you get a good deal, it supports the show. What deals? When you purchase anything from the website, Amazon, healthcare supplements, you're covering our six. And to the ladies on the team, when you outfit yourself in the super sexy threads from Naked Zebra, and yes, I'm talking about in fuego, you are firing the sniper shot for our commandos. How else can you support? It's simple. You smash the follow and subscribe buttons on our social media. That is how you support us bringing great guests to talk about serious subjects, not the mainstream media's fake news. So thank you, and until our next show, stay in the attack and go Commando.